and trying to take a look at some election data, and to use election data to help elucidate some of the narratives that I think a lot of politicians, a lot of ideologues, a lot of folks who represent various constituency groups try to push out after an election. They're not always accurate. So I wanted to break this one down from Ted Cruz, senator from Texas, Republican. Ted says today's Dems are the party of the rich. The GOP is and should be the party of the working class. And he is highlighting this tweet from assistant professor of psychology, so not necessarily somebody who's doing election stuff, but it says the Democratic Party is rapidly becoming the party of the professional managerial class. And he highlights this data. You can take a look at it. The presidential vote in the 100 counties with the largest share of college degrees. Okay, now this is super obvious, but this is why I want to do this, right? Because I saw a lot of Republican politicians sharing this, and it's actually a left criticism of the Democratic Party that gets echoed by Republicans. So it's very interesting to me from that perspective too. Okay, but let's set aside the ideology, set aside the narrative for a second. What is the data showing us here? Presidential vote in the 100 counties with the largest share of college degrees. Counties don't vote, people do. So when we look at results by county, that doesn't actually tell us anything about the population of people in those counties. And when we're looking at this data in particular, right, this data is really interesting because it changes over time, right? The 100 counties with the largest share of college degrees, those counties change over time. Now, if you want to show me one county and give me a narrative about it over time, maybe that's kind of interesting. Maybe different people are moving in or moving out. Maybe it's stayed relatively stable, but like one party has made inroads and the other has lost voters there. This is different counties over time too, right? Or it might be. I'm not really sure. But like this is the problem that you run into with county level data. So within a given county, we know that there's households there. We know that there's voters there. We know what the vote counts are, but we don't necessarily know who in that county actually voted and produced the votes, right? So some of the analysis that you see, it's good because we have something to go on in that particular county. So there's some counties that are, mostly Latino. There are some counties that are mostly black. There are some counties that are mostly white people with no college degree, whatever the metric is that you're looking at. So you can look at some of these counties and draw some conclusions about them. But really, we just don't have a lot of good data immediately after an election. People have talked about the polls before the election getting a lot of stuff wrong, the exit polls that are done, during the election, like while people are mail voting or voting early, or while people are leaving a polling place. Those can have problems too. Those get rebalanced over time as we get a better idea of what the actual electorate looked like. And a lot of times the gold standard for this stuff is after the election. Sometimes way after the election, you survey people, but then based on their answers and based on who they are, you verify that they voted. So you do these verified surveys. Our voter records in America, whether or not you voted, if you voted, that's a matter of public record. That's transparency that's baked into the system. How you voted is private. Your ballot is secret. So what's interesting with some of these post-election analyses is you can actually verify that someone you're talking to voted. There's some interesting stuff that goes on, like people are more likely to report after the fact that they voted for a winner. There's kind of a bandwagon effect, so you got to correct for that too. So none of this stuff is perfect. But after the election, if you're patient, if you hold off on the hot takes for a while, if you don't get sucked in by the ideological debate over who really represents the working class, and if you if you're not Ted Cruz and you're not trying to score some political points on Twitter, you just look at the data. So if we go back to 2016, this is elucidating. This is from Pew, which did one of these post-election analyses, and this stuff is good, right? So this is higher quality stuff. One thing I'm holding up here that you don't always see in election data is the share of the electorate for each of these categories. And these are all income categories. As people report their income, they say what their family's income was as part of a broader survey about all their other demographic info, race, age, gender, all that good stuff. So this is ranked from least amount to most amount of income. And the first thing that you should notice here is that the electorate share, and this is kind of obvious, but think about how often you see this data without this attached to it, right? There's a lot more people who are part of the electorate. 28% of the electorate is folks who make less than $30K a year. Folks who make $150 or more a year, That's only 7% of the electorate, right? And that makes sense, right? The populations are different. Now these income groups, they vote at different rates, and we're not going to get into that. But the share of the electorate that they constitute, the fraction of the total number of people who bother to vote in a given year, there's just a lot more people making less than 30K in America. So they're more than a quarter of the electorate. Yeah, good for them. And they're actually they're the biggest difference between party vote share in 2016 by income was this group. Clinton's at 58%, Trump's at 32%. I should say this data, as with all election data, there's almost never a strong emphasis on people who vote third party or people who vote but leave the presidential line blank or leave other parts of their ballot blank. There are at least 1.7 million people like that. In 2016, they don't show up in a lot of these analyses. And then, of course, non-voters, we almost never talk about them, but a lot of non-voters became voters this year, right? That's why we have a very high turnout election. So I like thinking about those folks a bit more than some other people in this business because I'm a democracy nerd. But in any case, so the electorate share goes down for each income group. And if we take a look at these next income groups, now Republicans are starting to do better, but it's a lot closer. 42-54, 48-56, 39. 55, right? And then the higher income group, right? Even though this higher income group is a lower share of the electorate than the lowest income group, they're bare majority and slightly bigger majority for the Democrats. Now that's interesting to me. So the Democrats aren't the party of the rich, right? Both parties can lay claim to having a lot of rich supporters. But what's interesting here is that for a lot of Democrats who are higher income, they support wealth redistribution, they support higher taxes, they support more social services, they support more equity, economic equity in society. And that's a big part of the Democratic narrative. I'm not sure that they push that as much. I don't know. But so why is Ted Cruz saying this? They're the party of the rich. Well, people don't like rich people, right? But let's think about what rich means in this context too, right? Okay, so if you're in these income bands here, like your family income, that's good, but we're measuring income here. We're measuring what comes in each year. We're not measuring wealth, right? So imagine if you will, someone who has been teaching for a long time and has built a lucrative career as a teacher. Where are they going to fall in here? How much are they making a year? And this might be somebody who has a master's degree. I don't know, maybe they're in this band. Maybe they've been, teaching for a long time. Maybe it's a 2-income household and they're up here, right? But do they have a lot of wealth? Well, if they have a lot of student debt, that might make it harder for them to build wealth. What if they're in an area with really expensive housing, like some of these cities have gotten in the past couple of years, right? If you can't afford a house, if you don't have a mortgage, if you're spending a lot of money on rent, how are you going to accumulate wealth? So we got a lot of people in this country who have some decent income, but who have trouble building wealth because that other stuff drags them down. The income coming in isn't enough to make up for all the other stuff that's going out the door. Okay, so you can construct a bunch of different narratives here. I think especially in these middle bands, like what the heck is a working class voter, right? So what is Ted trying to do here? GOP is and should be the party of the working class. Well, I don't know. I think if you're able to do things that materially benefit the working class, you should just be able to talk about them, right? So people try to have these arguments about the electorate that are divorced from policy. It's about who I represent and who I want my party to represent. And a lot of people, who think they're working class, other people might say, well, I don't think you're working class. Maybe your income is up here, and so you're not working class. And you could have an argument about that. I think like the Trump boat parades are really interesting in that regard. Are those folks working class? Like at what point, like how nice does your boat have to be before you don't identify as working class anymore? If like you have a truck and that's like culturally like part of how you identify as a working class voter, are you using the truck for work? Right? Is it actually like hands-on stuff that you're doing? Do you do hands-on work, but you're the owner of your business, so you're a small business owner? If you're the owner, does that make you working class? Or are you owning class with working people and you're part of a working class culture, but you're the owner, right? Or to go back to that teacher example, like you have a master's degree, but you can't get ahead economically. And you support redistribution of wealth, you support major public funding for schools, maybe you're part of your teachers union, maybe you led a teacher strike, right? Are you working class, even though you have a master's degree? So a lot of this stuff gets conflated. I think when you look at the college versus non-college data, I prefer looking at that in the context of income. right? And that's why this income data is ultimately more interesting to me, because we have a lot more college graduates than we did 20, 30, 40 years ago. That undergrad degree to have graduated from college, that's like an entryway to a lot of jobs now. That wasn't true 30, 40 years ago, where you could have a much more sustainable income and you could support a family without having to go to college or get a college degree. And the colleges have all gotten more expensive, right? So you could do that without accruing a bunch of student debt. So that's interesting too. And then of course that, like, what I'm not showing here is all this data broken down by race, and you can do that too, and you'll find that all this data is highly polarized by race, because the supermajority of people of color vote for Democrats, and that's been true, since the parties flipped on civil rights issues. So if you look at this data by just one of these metrics, you can start to create some misleading narratives, and people are just more complicated than that, right? And I guess the other thing I always take away from this is, like, no group in America is like really a monolith. Like if you look at Black women specifically, they're one of the most overwhelmingly Democratic groups, and there's still a few percent that are voting for Republicans, and they're voters too. They have a perspective too, but at this level, like even here, right? So 32% of folks who make less than 30K a year went for Trump in 2016, and these other ones are, they're a little bit more even. The 75 to 99, you get a nice gap going there too. But really, like even at the most extreme, you're talking about a third of the people not necessarily fitting into your narrative. And sometimes it's like a fifth of the people who don't necessarily fit into your narratives. This is also useful to think about for, like, Republicans who live in really blue states, right? Their electoral votes wind up being worth zero under our system. And the same thing goes for people who vote for Democrats in very red states, right? And sometimes, like, even in like a big blue city, you're talking about like 10, 15% of the population. And there's a lot of ways that our system is structured that essentially does not value those votes for those folks, and that it creates bad incentives for the parties. And I think you also just have selfish incentives for folks like Ted Cruz, who want to compete for more of these votes. And why does he want to compete for more of these votes? Because look, this is where all the people are at, and as we established earlier, it's people who vote, not counties. So I hope that's helpful, and I'm sorry that that we don't have really good election data immediately after an election. We could have much more accurate conversations about what the electorate looks like. But based on what we do know, I think it's helpful to establish this baseline and view some of these other attempts at claiming one particular group exclusively for your party. I don't think that really works. You always got to compete for people's votes, and you always have to make sure that the people that you're speaking to, know that you want to fight for them. So that this is a bid for some more working class support. Is it going to work? Is it not going to work? Josh Hawley tries this. JD Vance has written about this in Hillbilly Elegy. So we'll see. But I just cast a skeptical eye on it. Show me the data. Show me the income data. Define working class for me precisely, either culturally, economically, you name it. I did see your question earlier. I answered it in chat. But just to say a little bit more, like each party has their narrative about what the other party's supporters are like. And I think that you have to draw a distinction between voters and supporters. So like the people who went to Trump rallies in 2016, if you count every single person who went to a Trump rally, who like love the dude, every attendee, if you add them all up together, it's 1.4 million people. Right? That sounds like a lot of people, but it's actually only 0.4% of the US population. It's 0.4% of the population. So the people who are voting for a candidate, they're not at the level of fervent support of heading to a rally. They're not at the level of, donating, that sort of thing. And a lot of people vote, just for traditional reasons. My mom and dad voted one way, I'm gonna vote that way. So people have all different motivations for how they vote, different issues they want to pay attention to. I think for campaigns, unfortunately, the incentive structure is to just pay attention to voters in areas where there's competitive elections. So if you live in an area with a competitive election, if you have a demographic profile that candidates want to go after, if you have certain issues that you care about that candidates are interested in, you're going to be a priority for them. And there's not a really good incentive to just go after every voter. If we elected our presidents by popular vote, maybe that would change a little bit for the parties. The Democrats, they need to make up more ground in rural areas, given the structure of American politics and how it works. Rural areas are overrepresented
in the Congress and in the Senate. So, that's something that they've been working on for a while, that they could do more. It's something where Republicans have obviously made a ton of investments. That's how they're able to keep a lockdown on a lot of their seats. So yeah. I mean, it just all depends. But I've found it very different when I've worked in areas that like Ohio was competitive for the presidential election more so in 2016. It might be less competitive now. I know folks who've worked in Virginia. It used to be really competitive, so they would get showered with more attention from both parties. So now that's stepped away. But if you're a Georgia voter, you're kind of the center of the political universe now. So a party that might not have had you on their radar to persuade you or get you over to their side 10 years ago, 20 years ago there, now, you got these big statewide races. The electoral votes are up for grabs. There's going to be 2 Senate seats up for grab, that sort of thing. So, that's what the parties are going after. They want to make sure that they're competitive. And especially in the American system, we have 2 major parties. So they're always going to try to fight each other to get just a hair over 50% than the other one. We don't have coalition politics like a lot of the European countries. So I hope that's helpful. I'm gonna see if I fix the audio issues. Hopefully the audio is going good on this one, and I'll cross post this back over at my podcast. And I'm excited for that because it's more fun to talk about data when we can look at the data. I think, as opposed to me verbally summarizing the data. Okay, cool. Have a good one.